everybody. Welcome back to Allegory Story. My name's Tegan Aline.
My name is Melanie Nevis.
And today we are continuing our deep dive on witches because it's October. And if we were ever going to look into witches, this is the time to do it.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Today, we thought we would do something similar with the concept of witchcraft as a whole. And I think it's safe to say that Mel and I were both like, whoa, there's a lot.
It's a really vast topic. It's a really vast topic that is kind of convoluted. Things overlap, and then they differ in a lot of really
opinions
interesting ways.
Heavily vary. Yeah, exactly.
Yes, yeah.
So it's going to be an interesting one, but we're going to attempt our best to explore it in an hour. I'm pretty sure it could use more time than that, but that's the time that we've got. So I will say upfront that I have been practicing witchcraft actively for most of my life. And that's been like a pretty private process. Like just the fact that I'm even saying this like into a microphone right now, almost like I'm almost scared. Like I think a year ago you wouldn't have caught me saying that because it's been a very private practice, but there has been like a wider kind of like people have become more open to this in more recent years, and there's lots of people practicing different variations of craft all over the world. And I think you also have some connections to it as well, no?
Yeah, I do. And for the longest time, I've been asked before by some friends where they're like, "Are you a witch?" And I'm like, "I don't know. Am I?"
I don't know. Yeah, that's what I always said.
Like,
I don't know.
I don't know. Am
Maybe.
I? And then I kind of like look around my house and I look at the books and I look at like the little jars of stuff that I have. And I'm like, oh.
The jars are a dead giveaway. If you have an entire cupboard of jars, you're a human crow and you like jars, that's definitely like a sign.
Well, yeah, I've got like little spell jars where I didn't really even think about it that are filled with herbs and then like little runes on pieces of paper. And I'm like, oh, and then I poured wax on it and I put crystals on it. And I'm like, oh, but they're just like protective things.
Put a wax seal on it. Put a crystal on it. Put a bird on it.
Yeah,
whatever.
They're just protective things. But oh, I guess that's kind of witchy. And I'm like, I have like a very ritualistic thing that I do in the morning. I'm like, oh, yeah, I'm a witch. What kind of witch? I don't know.
Yeah. Well, and this is kind of the interesting thing when like so for me, what happened was when I was like, I grew up Catholic, first of all. And for when I was about 12 or 13, we went through our confirmation. And this is like when you go into the church and you're like, I'm confirming that I am a Catholic and I'm going to be Catholic forever now. And I think at 13 doing that, it's like there's a reason that happens at that age, because you're just about to go into your age of self-discovery. And basically for me, it was like I declared myself a Catholic because that's what everybody at my school was doing. And then the next year I was like reading like 6 books on Wicca. You know what I mean? And at the time it felt like I shouldn't be doing that, but I was so drawn to it. But it was like the opposite of everything that I've learned. Now as an adult, I realize the majority of like old time witchcraft is really the concepts of what we know historically are really drafted and created by Christian people, actually, essentially, in a way. But it felt so weird to me at that time.
In a way, I agree with you, because and I think a lot of people think that witches are more of a Christian invention, but like,
well,
the
here's
idea,
the thing. It's the terminology, right?
Yeah.
It's not that they created anything. It's the terminology and the way that they attached terminology to negative ideas. So the terms are created, like the term of paganism, the term of
Mhm.
witchcraft is all kind of created by people who were talking about it historically in a negative sense. Anyways, we'll get to all that. We're gonna get to all that.
We'll get there. Like, because I do think that a lot of people think it's a Christian invention. The idea of this witch that flies in the night and like draws her power from dark cosmic forces. But like it does predate Christianity by centuries. If you look at Homer's Odyssey, which was written circa 800 BCE,
Mhm.
Circe turns men into animals and is described as a witch. Like
Right.
Plutarch refers to witchcraft on his treatise of superstition, which was written in the year 100. And then you have illicit magic, which features really heavily in Roman law statutes. And actually, this is actually really, really cool. Archaeologists have found hundreds of ancient Greek curse tablets, which
Hmm.
I think the Greeks called katares or katares. I don't speak Greek. I don't know. Which are curses that bind tight, and they appear to have invented them. So like it goes way further back than
Hmm.
Christianity. Many of these curse tablets were focused on sporting competitions or legal contests, and they would be left in graves or wells or fountains where the dead could better work their magic. So underground.
So I think it's really interesting because so when I was 13 and I was learning all this stuff, I was picking up books that I was finding in like the occult section at bookstores. You know what I
Mhm.
mean? And what I understand today is the majority of what I was reading was actually modern day neo paganism, Wicca. And
Yeah.
I didn't at the time, I had no concept that all of that part existed. Like I came into the story at that moment, so I was taking probably most of what was being said in those books as definitive rule.
Mhm.
And that's probably also part of my Catholic upbringing, because in the Catholic Church you're like taught that this is the way God is, this is the way Jesus is, this is the way the world works. So
Mhm.
even stepping out of that, stepping into a new kind of discovery, I was still applying the same type of method. So I thought that Wicca was witchcraft and vice versa and all this, and didn't realize that there had been a lot going on before I'd shown up. But with that being said, it's still relatively modern. So I think it would be a great idea if we could examine quickly the difference between witchcraft, Wicca, and paganism, because I think this is kind of like a thing that if you don't look into it can get confusing. And like you said, they all kind of like bleed into each other in certain ways and that kind of thing. So it'd
Mhm.
be interesting to kind of like look at that a little bit. You know what I mean?
Yeah, for sure. Because I think that witchcraft is like, well, all of them are really nebulous terms, but witchcraft is really hard to define because it is so open to interpretation depending on, whoever's practicing or studying it.
So that's kind of exactly it. So when I was kind of looking through all of my books and looking online today, I got the sense that witchcraft is kind of defined specifically as a craft. So I think one of the things that I had an aha moment about in looking into this was that witchcraft in itself doesn't have like a defined theology or belief system behind it.
Mhm.
So it's not a witchcraft in itself is not a religion. It's simply a craft. So you can be a witch and you can have like spell jars and things around your house. And it's the act of creating the craft that it feels important to you. It has certain properties based on the plants or the things that you're using, but it's the actual task of crafting that makes it a craft. And it doesn't have to be connected necessarily to like any type of gods or anything like that. And when you start to kind of look at things from um like a perspective of having a structure, a spiritual structure around it, that's
Mhm.
actually when you start to delve into this idea of Wicca, because Wicca is kind of like the modern day offshoot based using a word that is Old English.
Yeah.
And it's also kind of like a revamped idea. And doubly so, witchcraft, what we would think as witchcraft in this moment, like the concept of crafting the spells, that kind of work, that is how we as like us as people, usually as witches, would define that. But that is witchcraft defined by historians and
Mhm.
anthropologists is more to what you were talking about earlier, like this
Yes.
concept of women who like have pacts with the devil and use demonology to perform all of these spells and things like that. The what is it? I'm gonna want to say a word, but I feel like I'm gonna say the wrong word. Malevolent, working with malevolent
Okay.
spirits. That's it. I was
Yes.
like, it's on the tip of
Yeah.
my tongue, and I also want to say maleficent, and I know that's wrong. That was last season, you know. So I think that that is really really interesting, and I hope I kind of. Do you have anything to add on that, like, or does that kind of
No,
explain it?
I think that's a perfect distinction between Wicca and witchcraft, where, I think that a lot of, or all Wiccans can define themselves as witches, but not all witches will define themselves as Wiccans.
Exactly. And that's, I think, really important because Wicca is a relatively modern and when we use the term neo, it means like something more new aged almost, but it's a relatively modern concept. And I think from what I was looking at today, it really kind of started in and around like the 1940s, actually. Um, and there were a couple, like I can get into the names, but I don't know if I want to get into the names. But basically, there was this guy named Gerald Gardner, and he claimed back in. Do you have the witch's Bible?
No, I don't. I was
Okay.
just pulling out Scott Cunningham's Wicca for the solo practitioner book.
Okay. Okay. So we're going to get to, well, I don't have a lot of information on Scott Cunningham, but he's kind of like, I think a lot of what a lot of people refer to in, but he's still Wiccan, still considered Wiccan
He
by a lot
he
of,
is Wiccan.
by a lot
Yeah,
of
no,
people.
no, no. He's 100% Wiccan.
But anyways, Wicca, it's very interesting because the history is that, like what Mel was saying earlier, witchcraft can encompass a lot of, like, it can be an umbrella term for a lot of folk practices that come from other communities and other cultures, and it can be really individualized to the person. And like you were explaining to me right before we started the podcast, that like you have these certain traditions that you learn from family members that are traditions, and your background is Portuguese. My background is Canadian, but ultimately like Welsh and British, you know what I mean? And you learned these things, and you will always incorporate at some point in some way, you'll incorporate those things into your practice. But there are things that I never learned, so I wouldn't even know to do it. And that's kind of like the interesting thing. And also like the danger game with all of this stuff, especially in the context of the time that we're in now, when we're kind of exploring the ideas of cultural appropriation and what that means. And I think it's very interesting because from what I was like listening to and researching earlier, it seems like up until the 19th century, the concept of a witch and witchcraft is very much locked into this idea of like the historical version, quite negative, quite
Yes.
dangerous. And it's only in the 18th century when rich bougie people start to become interested in the occult that it starts to shift. And with that, going into the 20th century, even more so, there starts to become like a lot of British people that are getting really deeply into magic, and they start to create their own structures, their own religious systems. And that's where we get back to that Gerald Gardner guy, because he claims to have been inducted into a coven, but he won't specify the coven. He won't talk about them for the sake of their privacy. It's supposed to be like very,
Mhm.
mystical, but a lot of people debate whether or not it even really happened. And so he learns all of this knowledge from them and decides to start his own version of like witchcraft practice called Gardnerian Wicca.
Gardnerian. Yeah.
Yeah, Gardnerian Wicca. And this is like the first kind of form of Wicca, but it does, honestly, I'm going to say pilfer. It pilfers a lot from folkloric traditions of witchcraft from different places in Europe, and including he is also the one that creates the Sabbat calendar, which I know that's not
Mhm.
actually the way you're supposed to say it, but when you were studying this stuff growing up like me, that's what you said, but that's not actually the even proper way to pronounce it. But he created that, and it's pulled from like a bunch of different cultures. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So Wicca becomes quite, in today's day and age, I think the roots of it are quite questionable, and they're not as old as we would be led to believe. It started in the 40s.
Yeah, I think, like you said, it kind of pilfers a lot of older traditions. So this Sabbat calendar is followed by Wiccans, but it's also followed by a lot of priestesses in the Nordic tradition. And I think that's actually where it was pilfered from.
So here we go, because
Yeah.
then it's like from the Gardnerian tradition, just like the Catholic Church, people break off and start their own version. So then there's the Alexandrian tradition, which is
Mhm.
where I kind of found myself at the beginning of my Wicca journey, I'll call it, because I was reading the
Mhm.
Witch's Bible, and that was written by Alexandrian practitioners. And those practices are very heavily focused on rituals, on having ritual tools, on having wands and cauldrons, and like using all of those things. Also, very centered in like a divine feminine and a divine masculine, like a high priest, a high priestess, a horned god, a moon goddess. But it's still kind of vague. Like a horned god, there's many versions of horned gods in many cultures, and same with the moon goddess. So technically as a Wiccan you could still work with like pantheons from like other traditions and just bring them into yours, which is interesting on one hand, but also where we run into this issue of like appropriating things, just taking things from anywhere, like we think we could just take things of anywhere. And then also there's another variation of that, which is the Dianic tradition, which is way more feminist focused. So, and all of these things, that's like some branches of Wicca. That all falls under the umbrella of neo-paganism, because it's the modern day. And then when we start to delve into like what the word pagan means, again, it's like a term that was kind of created, I think, around the 4th century to describe people who were practicing polytheistic religions. So
Mhm.
early Roman, like pre-Christian Roman traditions, Greek traditions, anything where there's more than one god, where there's like a group of
Mhm.
gods, right? And so in that, the modern day practices of like Hellenism, which is the practice of following the Greek kind of traditions and the Greek gods. Heathenry, which is like the German neo-pagan subgroup, where they follow, they're more about believing in nature and spirits in nature, but it's like
Yeah.
the German kind of version of this. And then there's so many more, like modern druidry falls into neo-paganism technically. Like the list is pretty extensive, and I mean,
It's very vast, it's very extensive,
anytime
and
somebody's taking or trying to like take the ideas of like the way people pre-Christian, pre-Judaism, pre-Islam would have worshipped, and we're trying to recreate it in this time, and we're filtering it through our lens, it kind of starts to fall into this like neo-pagan idea. And
Mhm.
what's doubly interesting is sadly and unfortunately, there are a few of these traditions that are very heavily attractive to white supremacy.
Yes, that is 100% true.
And I think
Um,
we have to touch on that, especially
yeah.
like being white people that like practice this kind of stuff or are aware of these kinds of things. It's important to talk about that, because what I learned to like in while looking this up today is that this one I mentioned a minute ago, the heathenry, this was actually used during World War II by Hitler, and he was actually using ruins on his flags. And he was using this idea of returning to the old religion or the old culture as a way to kind of stimulate people into the idea of like, we are the right race. And a lot sometimes these cultures can really centralize themselves around race. And in the world that we're living in today with social media and stuff, I've seen tons of people remarking that unfortunately the Germanic and the northern, like more Norse style neo-paganism practices, they see a lot of that white supremacy trying to be funneled through that. And I think also Wicca does that in a way too, right?
I think that's also a reflection, like any tradition that's practiced is a reflection on society. And right now, there are issues throughout the world of white supremacists rising up, and you see it in a lot of political things and a lot of religious things, and it perfectly mirrors what's happening in society. This is not a good thing. I'm not saying that it's a good thing or I'm
No,
saying it's
I
an
think
excuse.
we
It's
can
just a
both
mirror.
agree that we don't think that this is a good thing.
Yes.
What I think is very interesting is that I think a lot of time people don't necessarily think that their spiritual practice can be politicized. And
Hmm.
just talking briefly about like what Hitler was doing with a term, with a style of paganism back during before World War II, just goes to show that people have been finding ways to manipulate spirituality to lead certain, like lead people to a certain idea that's usually around race and the supremacy of a certain super white race. And it happens a lot. It happens in new age practice as well. And I think it's something that's kind of rampant in the community, which is kind of why I
Hmm.
feel it's important to talk about it, because with spirituality comes the concept of faith and the concept of belief and your relationship with everything. But it
Hmm.
sometimes I think that means that people put their critical thinking on the back burner, and we should not necessarily, there's a time and a place for that, but we shouldn't always be doing that because these things do get co-opted, and they have been
Oh,
getting
100%. They have
co-opted.
been. They've been co-opted throughout history. We have seen countless wars fought over religion
Yes.
and and
Yeah.
spirituality, right?
Yeah.
Like
Like
most
all
of
of
them.
them? Most of them.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Most of them. Let's be real. Most of them are
Yeah.
fought by that. And I know like Kale is often just like, okay, religion needs to die because there's no place for it
Oh,
anymore.
Michael says the same thing. He doesn't believe. I've always thought there kind of is a place for religion. I'm not religious myself. And in
Yeah.
fact, doing this research made me realize that I am a witchcraft practitioner, not a Wiccan, because I've never been devoted to a specific like god or a goddess. I've
Hmm.
always worked within nature, and I've always worked with like kind of like what you were saying, like more with plants and in the
Yeah.
kitchen and in the hearth and in that kind of thing.
Exactly, yeah. So I think we have a very similar definition of what witchcraft probably is, where it is a nature-based craft where you use the energy from natural elements to change something specific in your life or to help you achieve a goal. And like to me, witchcraft is the art of change, right?
Yes.
So like a person who practices
Transmutation.
witchcraft, yeah, exactly. Someone who practices magic, transmutation, divination, spells, potions,
Mm,
is alchemy, right? Herbalism.
mm.
It could also be someone who's clairvoyant or psychic. or has those abilities. And it can be something as simple as blessing your coffee or tea in the morning for you to have a good day.
Mhm.
And then it can also be really complex where you have complicated rituals and you have those different tools and ingredients.
It can also be very rooted in, like, a cultural folkloric practice. Like, I can't remember her name, and it's really pissing me off that I can't remember her name, but there's a great creator on TikTok who is Russian, and she has grown up in her family. She has been working with Russian folkloric magic her whole life, and she does a
Mhm.
fantastic, and she's incredible creator, very down to earth and very informative. And the way that she does things is not the way that you or I would necessarily do things, you know? And it's fascinating. It's so
Mhm.
interesting. It's so interesting to just like watch her and learn her story. I will try to find her information and add it into the description of this podcast, because I think she's really one of the best creators in and around talking about
Yeah.
witchcraft that I've actually seen on the internet. I really like
Cool.
her. So she's really interesting. And then there's that other girl I told you about who talks a lot about like working with demons, which I think is very,
Oh,
that's,
Chowan.
yeah,
Yeah.
that's another
She's really
conversation.
interesting.
That's another conversation for another time, because I think, again, our idea of what demons are is like very, very different from like what Eastern philosophy would think. And
Yeah.
so kind of dissecting that and looking into it is good.
That's for another time. It is, and there's so many demons to touch upon, like, the historical aspect of it, of learning about Lilith or even
Yeah.
Pazuzu is really fascinating as well, so,
But
but
I
you did touch upon
yeah, sorry, go ahead.
sorry.
No, it's okay.
I was going to say you did touch upon folk magic, and I was reading a book called Italian Folk Magic, and I honestly love this book. And it kind
Hmm.
of brought to life for me a bunch of things that I grew up with that I wouldn't have even, and I never really acknowledged or thought about.
Mm.
And it's funny because, I've heard stories of my sister used to have nightmares growing up, and my mom was like convinced that there was a woman and she couldn't have kids, and my sister was a baby. And my sister used to sleep perfectly fine. And then this woman came and she wanted to carry my sister. And my mom was like, no, 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 no. And all of a sudden, my sister had nightmares and would stay up crying all night. And my mom was just
Whoa.
like, no, she cursed your sister. She hexed your sister, like did something to your sister. She can't sleep
Mm.
at night anymore. And like, there was all these things. And I hear about the bruxas, but they're like the bad witches.
Hmm.
But there's things that are then done to counteract that. And I'm like, hold on. But if
Are
you have
you
a practice
hexing
to
a hex?
counteract it, no, but like you can break a hex. So
Hmm.
I was reading this Italian folk magic book, and I believed, and I'll keep this person anonymous, I believed that someone had been hexed or cursed, and there was this way to like tell and break it in this book. So I
Hmm.
decided to try it out. And I kid you not, it fucking worked. I swear to God it
I
worked.
believe that it worked. I believe that it worked.
Yeah, I swear it worked, where you have to like take some oil in a bowl of water and some salt, and like you, depending on how the oil falls, and you put it above the person's head, depending on how the oil falls in the bowl, once you cut
Hmm.
it with the knife, it tells you whether or not the person has had the evil eye placed upon them.
This is so interesting.
And then it Yeah, and then it tells you how to break it. And I grew up Catholic, Roman Catholic, but I am not a religious person. I'm a spiritual person. But I believe that all of these saints of Catholicism do originate from pagan saints, and they all have a different name. So to me, I don't care if I call someone the Archangel Michael, even if I don't necessarily believe in the Archangel Michael. I'm like, sure, there could be an entity that goes by many different names. So I started doing this spell, I guess, to break the curse. In it, I was calling upon Michael throughout the entire thing. And you could feel it in the air, like something changed, something felt different. And the course of direction afterwards just felt different for the person,
Have
where
you
it,
ever looked into who Michael is in the different?
I should.
You
I
should.
didn't, but I should. I
Because there's
should.
like there's two things that are very interesting about what you just said in relation to working with him. So yesterday I went to this museum that's in the village by my house, and the museum is all about this area. And this area has a very interesting history because it has they have found artifacts here from antiquity, from like the 4th century. So the whole entire museum is actually in a beautiful, like, kind of, it looks like a castle, but actually what it was a monastery. And the whole conversation in this, because within this place is this gorgeous chapel. And in the chapel, on the ceiling, there are these beautiful, like almost like medieval style paintings. And the
Mhm.
paintings are of 12 men and 12 women. And they are called like the Sibyl, I think. And the Sibyl are actually the Christian Catholic version of a soothsayer, of a person who tells the future. But they don't tell the future for you or I. They tell the future in relation to God. Like they're kind of like prophesizing what's going to happen for God. So I actually went to this museum with a friend of mine here that's French. And so a lot of the information is in French. And she was kind of like helping me understand it and explaining it to me. And what she was saying, that the museum itself is actually trying to openly display, it's a new museum, it's only opened in the last 2 years, is that Catholicism came here, like basically in where I live currently in the Southwest in the Midi Pyrenees, this area in the beginning of like the 1st century was Gaulois or Gaul. So connected to the Celts, and that's a whole other thing, migration thing to get into. But very early on as 3rd and 4th or even 2nd century, the Roman Empire was here. And the community became Gallo-Roman, so like a combination of the Gauls and the Romans. And then when Christianity kind of takes over, like the Roman Empire, basically they went to all of the places where the Roman Empire was, and they found ways to kind of take the traditions that were local to all of these places and Catholicize them. And so what the Sibyls actually are the Catholicized version of like future tellers, fortune tellers. And I was explaining to her, I found it very interesting because growing up as a Roman Catholic in Canada, you would never hear about a mystical reader that was part of Catholicism, because now in
Mhm.
North America, we're so far removed from that, they don't even need to bring it up. And nor would you hear of women doing this at all. Whereas here, there's literally paintings of these women on the ceilings, kind of declaring them as these like wise female prophets. And that
That's really
village is,
cool.
yeah, that village is really kind of very well known for having like a quite feminist connection to things very, very early
Mhm.
on. But now they've kind of restored this church that kind of shows the example of that. So that's
That's
like,
awesome, I'd love to see
but
it.
this kind of goes to the idea of what you were saying earlier, that like Catholicism kind of came in and put their spin on everything to make it palatable for local people. And then there's that other conversation that I think you and I had a long time ago about masking. And masking
Mhm.
was usually the practice of, sadly, when people were getting pushed, like being forced to, I don't even want to say immigrate, like they were being forced into the islands and everything, from out of Africa into the islands
Yeah.
because of slavery. They wanted to hold on to their cultural practices, but they weren't allowed, and they were all being kind of like forced into Catholic conversion. So what they did is they took the imagery of like a Christian deity, an angel, whatever, and they put that over the person they were really praying to. And so you see that in like the Santa Maria and all of those kinds of the practices that are more collected in like folk magic or folk practices from
Mhm.
Africa and Latin America, the mixing of that. And so like this is the whole thing, right? Like, this is why it's such a convoluted conversation, because sometimes people had to do this out of necessity. Sometimes
Hmm.
people were doing this as kind of like a manipulation tactic. And sometimes now, because we were raised Catholic and we're kind of expanding our minds, sometimes you can feel connected to a deity even if you don't aren't necessarily connected to that religion. So it's
Yeah,
very
absolutely.
like, there's so much to consider in all of this. And
There are so many layers to consider, of course.
yeah, I'm
I
getting
know
overwhelmed
for
just
me,
trying to explain it all. Holy shit.
like for me, there are certain things where, just simple things like when you sweep and you want to like sweep your house and you want to put the dirt out the back door, never out the front door.
Oh, what if you don't
You
have a
don't
back
sweep out
door?
the front door because, well, then that's a problem. But like traditionally in houses, there would be like a front and a back door in
You don't
Portugal,
have a
right?
back door. Oh, okay.
I guess you would actually just sweep it up and then toss it in a bin outside your house for garbage collection or something.
So there we go. That whole concept again, that's like something like kind of specific to like maybe like a more Portuguese folkloric tradition,
Yeah,
right?
and I think that you see it in Italian folk magic as well. And I'm
Mm,
like, why is that? Well, it's because you want all the negative energy to go out the back door and you
mm.
don't want it to go out the front door because you want the good energy to know it can enter,
Right. Okay. Honestly, I
right?
don't know about everybody else, but me hearing that, I'm like, makes complete sense.
Yeah.
Complete sense. So I'm gonna raise you your Italian witchcraft book and see you my Welsh witchcraft book. I want to talk about it
Nice.
just because you mentioned that, because this is the one that I've been reading lately. And it's by Mara Starling, who I'm a huge fan of. I would also strongly suggest everybody check out her TikTok and Instagram because it's incredibly interesting. So, my family background is Welsh, but I never knew anything about Wales and kind of just saw it as part of the UK most of my life and didn't really understand. They were like a sovereign nation that got taken over, much like Scotland, and they still
Hmm.
live in the identity of that, like to this day.
Oh yeah, because
So,
they fought tooth and nail and they were formidable in
mm,
their fight.
other things, thanks to this book, I've been learning so much, like the fact that Merlin was actually Welsh.
Yeah. Well, there's a whole okay. Ah, that's for another episode.
Yeah,
There's a
I know.
whole thing that I've discovered about Merlin, okay? And
We should do a season around like,
Arthurian legends.
yeah, because I feel like there's
Yeah,
like a
let's do
lot
that.
to explore in that, and I feel like we're both quite interested in it. But anyways, this is really interesting because there's a lot of conversation about certain stories and certain practices in here that I know from reading Wiccan books growing up, but I would have never known that they were Welsh because at the time the authors didn't say this thing is Welsh, this thing is this thing is that. They kind of almost blended it into one thing and kind of assumed it as their thing, which is like such a white thing to do. You know what I mean? But at 13, I didn't know that. But seeing it now, I'm just like, I had no idea this was where this was from. But
Yeah.
I find this book really interesting because, like, for what you were saying, it makes it's actually helping me discover like way more about where my family is from and the practices that we have there. And sometimes I'm like, is the whole reason I was even interested in this stuff anyways because like I come from
Maybe,
literally Wales and France, and like I find myself,
maybe your DNA does hold memory.
so I always think about whales and like sea animals and the way that they managed, and turtles, and the way that they managed to find the place where they were born and return. Like, how do they do that? And I wonder sometimes if humans have that capacity buried somewhere in themselves as well. It's the only way I can logically justify how I ended up here. Logically justify how I ended up here. But yeah, anyways, all of this to say, it is incredibly broad. And then if we get out of looking at Wicca, neo-paganism, all of the different like sects of these groups that follow certain
Mhm.
specific ideas and all of the intricacies of that, there's a lot. What I think a lot of people do in this moment is they consider themselves practitioners of witchcraft, and then they just define what kind of witch they are.
Yes.
And I see
Which
that
I
a lot
have
on social media.
I don't even know how people can do that because I look into like green witchcraft, hedge witchcraft. I've looked into folk magic
But
and
those are part of the
I
definitions, though. Like a green witch is kind of considered one of these definitions of a type. It's
no,
just
I
like,
know they're all definitions, but they all kind of overlap and I'm like, "Oh, I can take bits and pieces of each one." And some people want to define themselves. I don't know that I do, and I guess that means I'm defined then as an ecclesiastic witch. Or sorry, not as an eclectic witch.
yeah, I know. I've always considered, for a long time, I considered myself an eclectic witch as well, until I kind of thought a bit more about kind of like what that meant, because a solitary eclectic witch, but then I realized like eclectic witchcraft kind of assumes that you can just take things from here, there, and everywhere, and I don't know that you can't, but I do feel like there are some practices that I do have that have I've actually been initiated into and I've been given
Mhm.
from other cultures, but I
Mhm.
often still will not speak out about those things because they're not my culture, but I will practice them privately, and I will practice them like with a lot of respect and gratitude, and I try to within that continue to learn about that culture, continue to participate in a way that makes sense for me as like a white woman in relation to that, and trying to like figure out how I can be of service to that culture as opposed to just taking the practice and assuming it as my own. I feel like if you ever identified as an eclectic witch, you kind of have to think about that at some
You
point.
absolutely do. But
It depends on what you're collecting, of course.
I think that's it. It depends on what you're collecting, but that's the whole idea of witchcraft.
It's true.
It's flexible enough to incorporate a variety of cultural traditions, and as long as you're practicing respectfully, I think that's okay. I've participated in coven rituals that are of
Like
Norse
with a
traditions with
coven,
Norse priestesses. Pardon?
with an actual coven.
Yeah, like an open coven.
Oh, I've always wanted to see what that would be like, and I've never actually met a coven ever.
Yeah, yeah,
So
it's
where
pretty
was
cool.
that?
Like
Was
most
that
of
in Toronto or?
Yeah, that was in Toronto. Most of my practice is solitary, but I have participated in like open coven rituals that are led by a Norse priestess.
Oh, that's so. And how did you feel about that when you did it?
It was very powerful. It was a huge learning opportunity for me.
Mhm.
And it was done with such the priestess did it with such an open want, and it was women only.
Mm,
So like there's this real bond of sisterhood that happens
mm,
as well.
mm,
And just feeling as though you're not alone and like you're openly sharing your grief and your
mm,
hopes. And
mm.
there's something really powerful in that, I think.
That's really
So it was a
nice.
really moving experience.
That's really nice. I like that you said that you were able to share your grief. Like
Hmm.
where I live, I feel like there are a lot of women here that do a lot of goddess practice, like goddess
Hmm.
movement type of practice. And I've seen kind of like the whole spectrum of it, from, ceremonies that are really aesthetic but not really touching on the deeper things, to the
Hmm.
opposite, till I've seen women that are really like kind of going through a deep rewilding process and like reconnecting with nature in a very primal way that's like very moving. And I often see in all of these situations, there's not a whole lot of space left open for negative, I'm going to say with quotes, air quotes, negativity. It's not negativity, it's expression of emotion, grief. A lot of the time they kind of want to focus on this like elevate your energy thing, and I find it kind of
Mhm.
frustrating, because really, like, in order to elevate your energy, sometimes you need to go through a grieving, you need to go through
You
a
do,
process.
and then
And this is
you let
very
go.
yeah, and this is very grounding. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I like the fact, to me, if there is a space for that in the work you do with a group, that's huge. That's huge.
Yeah.
That's a
Yeah.
big green flag. Like, that's a good
Yeah.
thing that they're allowing that.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So, like, I participate in those occasionally, and if I do, it'll generally be during the sabbats.
See, I've never celebrated those either, which further indicates to me that, like, I've never been I love the idea of like kind of celebrating the seasonality of things and what that historically meant and whatever. But like from a perspective of the wheel of the year, I was just like, I don't know. To be honest, I was kind of like, I don't have my shit together to like celebrate this like every court. Like, how many of them is there? There's like 8 of them or something.
There are 8,
Yeah,
and I
it's a
generally
lot.
just do the I generally, like, will do the big ones, you know? Because I feel like Easter, like Osara, is a really great time to like shed the winter and try and manifest what you want for the coming year and bring in the new. And like it is an expression of your hopes and desires, right?
Can I just
And
share
then,
with you that, like,
yeah.
in relation to that, where I live here, there's a really cool practice that I've never seen before, until I moved here. And it's always happening around February and March when the birch trees are starting to produce sap. But there are
Hmm.
people here that will go to the birch trees and tap the sap, and then they'll bring it to the market, and people will buy like bottles and bottles of this birch sap, and they'll drink it for like a week as a cleanse, as a it's a very gentle cleanse. And I've done it a few times, but it's interesting. It kind of relates to everything that we've said. This is clearly a folk tradition from here.
Yes.
You
Yeah.
don't I've never seen this done anywhere else. I'm sure it is done in other places. I've just never seen it before, but it is in that period of spring, like around that period of time. And it does kind of come with that idea of releasing like the winter, the concept of new growth or
Yes.
making space
Yeah.
for that. Yeah, it's really cool.
Yeah. Exactly, and I come from a family of farmers as well, so I think that's why I do
Mm.
follow the calendar a little bit, because even in the city, when it's harvest time, I am pickling things, I'm making sauce, I am, like, doing all of those things because it is harvest time. I don't have a garden to do these things now, but, like, the practice is still kept within me,
Hmm.
that it is the time to save and preserve for the winter. And like, so I think that I grew up with a family who was very seasonal and who took those practices from where they lived and still brought them here.
Yeah.
And growing up, it was just, it continued.
Talking about these folk practices, and I think this is the kind of like folk practice is kind of the stuff, it's like the sauce of it all. Like, that's the stuff that feels the best, isn't it? Like,
Yeah. To me, yes. Like, I'm realizing I do things when I'm sick. I was talking to you about this before we started, but like a recipe that I make for myself when I'm sick, it really doesn't make sense. I don't know that there's any scientific backing for this. It's called jamada, and it's literally a raw egg yolk in milk. And when I was little, my mother would make it more palatable by adding Nesquik, so it would be chocolate milk in a raw egg.
oh,
And I know that there are other Portuguese people who just do like raw egg and sugar, and like this helps with a sore throat and helps your lungs.
oh wow, really?
And I mean, that's what we think. And I know that when my sister and my nephew are
There is
really sick,
usually something to it. There's usually something
probably,
to
I
it.
know when they were sick last time, my mom, same thing. She's like, okay, here's a jamada. And, we get better. And then, oh, it's because of the jamada. Of
Yeah.
course. And I'm like, is it Is it just that
Psychosomatic.
yeah, is it just psychosomatic, like a placebo effect, or does it actually work? I don't know. How does a raw egg in milk actually help you get better?
I'm sure there's a little bit of column A.
There's dangers of salmonella.
True. Yeah, especially in North America. But there's probably a little bit
Yeah,
of common, like a little bit of column A, B, and C within all
yeah,
that. You know what I mean? There is,
yeah.
and that is something interesting about folk magic, especially if it's stuff that's been passed down through your family generations, and it's like a positive thing. It's actually a positive kind of like promise or energy from your
Mhm.
ancestors. And I think there
Yeah.
is something to be said for that element. Like for me, I like, I'm just looking around my office and I'm like, I've got my candles, I've got my medicine bundle, I've got my, like, my incense. Like, I work with craft. I work a lot. I spend a lot of time in nature. That's where I commune my energy. If I had to put a label on it, I would say probably closest to modern day druidry. And I actually don't know, I don't necessarily subscribe to that. I don't necessarily know a lot about it, but just from what I've been reading lately, that seems to be where it's at, because I work so much with plants and I work so much with animals. But, it's kind of always just been what felt right. And I haven't really had, up until now, I haven't really had a lot of friends that were interested in that, or that were interested in any of this stuff. So I've been it's kind of just always been me and nature, which is a good thing, and a bad thing in a way, because I felt kind of alone. And it's really only been
Mhm.
within the last 2 or 3 years where I've actually found way more of a community, studying with the eighth fire, which is related to the energy work that I do. That really
Yeah.
completely shifted my awareness, and also my awareness in relation to all of this other stuff that was already there before I got into that practice, and helped me figure out, like, actually gave me tools to kind of strengthen and increase my relationship with the things that I already had. So
Mhm.
that was really interesting. And it is kind of cool in a way. Witchcraft, let's say. So let's put aside anything that has deities. Not that there's anything wrong with deities, and we're actually going to do a whole podcast exploring that. But let's
Yes.
put that aside for a minute and just focus on the witchcraft element. Which is really cool about it is that you can kind of choose your own adventure.
Yeah, you can. And I think a lot of people there's been a big resurgence now. I think that a lot of people are frustrated with different aspects of societies and trying to work within social structures and what they're doing isn't always working. And I think that you have a lot more people right now that are like, well, if this isn't working, like, let's see what else is out there. Whenever there's events that really like shake the foundations of society, people tend to turn towards the occult. And then again, the fact that there is no set criteria for being a witch is the appeal. So you can choose your own adventure, as you say. And there's something really magical about that. It's like, I think that witchcraft beckons with the promise of spirituality that is self determined and often anti patriarchal and flexible enough to incorporate a variety of cultural traditions.
That being said, I agree with you 100%, but I think we'd be remiss if we didn't say that when you're going to get into a practice like this, sometimes it can happen when, that thing that happens when there's like too many options, and then you kind of
Yeah.
get lost in it all. That
Yeah.
that can also be an element that can happen. And in
Yes.
addition to that, when you are going to get into this kind of work, this is my personal belief. So actually, nobody else has to subscribe to this necessarily. But I do think if you want to do this work in a holistic way, where ultimately all of this boils down to communing, with nature, understanding that you are connected to and a part of nature. You are not like above nature, you are within
Mhm.
it. And
Mhm.
with that comes a certain, I think, a certain level of responsibility of being aware of, or at least trying your best to be aware of some of the areas where, things can get dodgy, because we have the natural world and then we have the world of man, and they overlap all the time, and they don't always overlap in a way that is healthy for nature or healthy for human beings.
Yeah.
So there's a deeper thing that comes along with like exploring witchcraft, is coming into the awareness of that. And that's something that's probably inevitably going to take time. Like I said, when I was 13, I was definitely studying Wicca and thinking it was like a definitive thing. And I don't think that
Yeah.
now at all. So
No, I think that,
finding that balance,
you you
that
have to find
groove.
that balance, and it's worth doing the research into the different things that you are studying so that you can actually respect where the traditions are coming from and better understand them. I think that for a lot of people that do turn towards it, a lot of people turn towards it with like the help of crystals, and they'll
Oh
like really
gosh.
get into tarot and oracle
So
decks
interesting.
and stuff
I'm
like
I'm an
that.
Oracle deck girl, I won't lie. I have like five.
I have a tarot and oracle deck that I love each of them
Crystals, I
pretty
think, is
fiercely.
that's a whole other podcast. I could talk about crystals and medicines, but I don't have a lot of good things to say, to be honest. But I still think it's worth talking
And
about.
I understand why. I understand
Hmm.
why. But I think that is very accessible to people, especially if they live
Absolutely.
in cities and things like that. It's kind of like the easiest way for them to get involved
For sure. And
and
honestly,
begin
I
to
was a
understand.
crystal girl as a child.
Yeah.
Same. So I totally get it.
Yeah. I love crystals. Like, you do feel power with certain ones, and like, I'll gravitate to some over others, but I there's a whole thing that comes with that of whether or not they're being sourced ethically,
Yes.
and what that actually means if you're
Again,
using them to practice. It's a
another
huge topic.
conversation for
Yeah,
another
it's a
time.
huge, huge
So
topic.
I don't know if we helped to clarify anything with this, or if we just made it more confusing. We'd be really happy to hear from you guys. But I think we actually have to wrap it now, because it's almost been an hour that we've been talking about this.
It's true.
I think we could talk about this forever. And I think we will come back and talk about this forever. But we hope that this conversation could kind of give you some ideas, some clarifications, or at least, help you begin to paint a picture of what witchcraft meant historically versus what it means now, what it means to the daily practitioners like us, or, what it means in context of the past.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I think so. I mean, like, you define yourself pretty early on, or started practicing pretty early on with a definition that has since changed. I think that mine
absolutely.
came around a lot later when people started to ask, and then I started to look around and be like, oh yeah, I do stuff.
Yeah.
I never really noticed. I guess I am. Okay.
And everybody's journey with that is different, but also you can, like, you don't have to even be doing this or be interested in this, but if we are going to do an entire season about witches, it's good to know what we're dealing with today, what we were dealing with back then, and
Hmm.
all trying to cover all of that kind of stuff in between, because I think there's so much mystification around witches, like we talked about in the last two episodes, that
Hmm.
breaking some of this down hopefully gives you a clearer idea of like what really kind of happens, all of the nuances in between, which there is a lot,
There are a
just like
lot.
there is for any energetic or spiritual practice, faith, anything like that. And, hopefully from that, you can kind of understand a little bit more of what people say when they're a witch. We didn't even get into the types of witch, but we'll do something around that. We'll figure that out later.
Yeah, we'll do that. Well, thank you
Anyways,
for joining, everyone, and we'll see you next time.
thank you so much, and we'll see you soon. Follow us on Instagram. We have an Instagram now. It's Allegory Story Podcast. Okay, thanks. Bye.